Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube, and you can find the link on our website if you want to check that out. This week we have Camille Avestruz from the University of Michigan, and she's going to talk about simulations for cluster-based cosmology. Camille, thank you very much for coming. Whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. I gotta say, I'm like super impressed that like not only do you have like the regular webinar series set up through Zoom, but that you're connecting it to live stream on YouTube. I think this is the first time I've seen any institution do that. So like props for like having all of the social media together.
Thank you.
Cool. So I'll be talking about simulations for cluster-based cosmology, and this is by no means going to be completely covering all of the work being done, but I did want to give a smattering of some of the efforts that I'm at least involved with. Hopefully also if there are folks in the audience who might be interested in joining some of those to encourage you to join in. These spaces are always looking for more collaborators. So just to start off, to sort of set the tone, the two example mock cluster images that I'm showing on this entry screen is two mock X-ray Chandra clusters from the Omega 500 simulation, simulated with the adaptive refinement tree code. On the left is what you might call a slow accretor, so not much has happened. It's very regular and round, and sort of you can get a nice clean signature and back out the cluster mass in there. Whereas the one on the right is what you might call, say, a fast accretor, where a lot has happened in the recent past. So it's this very irregular shape. And there are a number of ways to assess that, both in simulations and also in observations. And there are a number of ways that kind of a selection effect can bias your cosmology when you complete the cosmology train all the way to the end from measuring your cluster mass. So I'm going to start with just a brief upshot. I guess it's maybe not as early over there as it is for me, but just to give the brief upshot of the entire talk in 3 minutes. I just like to do this to sort of like get people prepped for what the main point is. All right, so one of the main reasons we like to study clusters is because they can provide a powerful cosmology constraint where everyone here knows, right, like primarily the energy density contents of our universe is comprised of dark energy. Then we have dark matter, and then the thing that we know best, which is atoms in this little sliver of this entire pie. To use clusters for cosmology, we have to be able to look at how their mass and abundance of mass behaves over cosmic time. But we can't really just weigh a galaxy cluster the way we might in a laboratory here on Earth on a scale. We have to infer the mass, and we infer the mass using some sort of an observable mass relation. But these observable mass relations can have some sort of a scatter or tilt and orbital normalization offset due to astrophysics that we don't necessarily fully understand. And it's very, can't really model this completely ab initio. So for example, right in the central regions of galaxy clusters, we have non-thermal support coming from active galactic nuclei and cooling and star formation and all of these things going on in that core. And then in the outer regions of galaxy clusters, we have this cosmic feeding activity coming in from filaments, filamentary structures. So we also have this sort of like non-regular sphericity going on that can affect our observables out there. So oftentimes what people do is they find a sweet spot in between those and say, okay, like, well, this is good enough, but you are like missing a lot of data. So having a full understanding of what happens, or fuller understanding rather, of what happens both in the central regions and the outer regions is sort of key to maximizing what you can do with cluster data. So in terms of maximizing what you can do with cluster data, you want as much data as possible. You want them in multiple wavelengths. And you want as good quality data as possible, both in terms of like depth and also resolution. And one of the telescopes leading the charge in this next decade will be LSST, Legacy Telescope. Okay, I'm always used to the old LSST of space and time. Legacy Survey of Space and Time. All right, so just a recap of, in case there are any beginning undergraduates or undergraduates in the audience, the point of doing cosmology is, well, most of the energy budget of our universe is really unknown, right? And energy, like, thinking about that is like in terms of MC squared, where we do know are the atoms comprised of Earth, Sun, us. And we know that most of the mass in our universe is not visible, is not comprised of this light emitting stuff, but is dubbed dark matter. And in the standard paradigm, it's called cold dark matter. And this is the underlying content that essentially drives structure formation through the collapse via gravitational forces. And then in the other scheme of things is this dark energy responsible for the accelerated expansion of our universe. This is truly the thing that we just don't know as much about. And this is what we try to probe when we make these cosmological constraints. So to talk a little bit more about why clusters specifically, well, clusters are the most massive gravitationally collapsed objects in our universe. They're comprised of hundreds to thousands of galaxies. And their structure formation is essentially, you can think of it as a tension between gravity promoting the collapse of structure and dark energy, so the accelerated expansion, suppressing the growth of structure. So since galaxy clusters are sensitive to this balance, you can think of it as a balance, we know that their abundance is going to also be sensitive to cosmological parameters. In particular, if we count the number of galaxy clusters as a function of their mass, as a function of time, we can compare what we observe to essentially what models then predict as a function of cosmology interpolated over different cosmologies. So this is an example of doing that exercise from now over a decade ago with some X-ray clusters. So in black is a lower redshift mass function, and in blue, higher redshift, so hierarchical structure formation means that you have more objects of any given mass further on in time. Data points correspond to the X-ray data, and then the solid lines essentially what you get out of like your models and emulators. And you essentially try to figure out what set of cosmological parameters best describe the data that you're seeing. So that's just highlighting here the mega lambda that popped out of that. So these particular masses were masses from the Chandra X-ray telescope. But as I mentioned before, right, you can't just weigh these on a scale, right? One does not simply weigh a galaxy cluster. That is the crux of where cluster cosmology has to do a lot of the work. So this is just a cartoon example of how we go about doing that, right? So for the example of X-ray measurements, gas measurements tell us about the mass. Here I'm showing just a pictorial view of the assumption of hydrostatic equilibrium, where thermal pressure, so pressure from gas emissions, because it's very hot, 1,000,000-degree ICM material, supports itself against self-collapse, which is that self-gravity. So what we know is if we measure pressure as a function of its radius, so temperature, essentially temperature times density, which we can get from the X-ray, we should be able to infer the mass inside that radius. So from simulations, we do have temperature, like quote, true temperature, because we can directly pull that out. We know exactly what the temperatures are. We know exactly what the densities are, at least within the sphere of those simulations. We can then use both of those to create mock synthetic Chandra X-ray observations, similar to the ones I showed you in that very opening slide. And you can see, right, like if you have a cosmological simulation, you can also start to capture some of those infalling substructures from filaments that are cluster feeding. So what you can then do is, right, you can try to do this apples to apples comparison where you take that mock data and you do what you do with your observations and you quote, make quote X-ray measurements of the mass. So here's an example of what that looks like. So in black is directly what you get from simulation data because you can pull out all the mass from all of the cells that you have. And in red is what you get from those quote X-ray measurements, where in the bottom panel, you see the fractional deviation. And you can see there's roughly a 20% deviation in the inner and the outer regions. And this is what I was alluding to in that very brief summary at the beginning, right? So there's other stuff going on in the inner and outer regions. And just to reemphasize, right, in the center regions, you have sources of like non-thermal pressure, such as energy feedback from extragalactic nuclei or supernova even, and you have this rapid cooling of gas to form stars that just really upsets this assumption of hydrostatic equilibrium. Also, right, our galaxy clusters are not spherical cows, even though it's like the nicest, neatest way to treat them that way. So you do have some filamentary structure feeding in, leading to this asphericity, and also that bulk gas motions leads to additional non-thermal pressure. All right, so the takeaway from this entire little section that I'm trying to paint for you here is that mass proxies are just that. They're proxies, and they have proxies with assumptions. In the case that I just showed you here, the particular set of assumptions were spherical symmetry and hydrostatic mass equilibrium. The thing is, each observable, not just X-ray, has its own set of challenges. So this is a nice little cartoon I got from Sebastian Bouquet. Many of you might have interacted with him through DES, but so here you can see a semi-mapping of all of these observables in the accuracy precision space, where good is in the upper right corner, and you'll notice nothing is the upper rightmost corner on its own, right? You have sort of weak lensing and galaxy dynamics, that's higher on the accuracy, lower on the precision, and then your SC effect, most of your gas stuff, and in addition to your optical richness, which are high on the precision, but not so much the accuracy. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, no one observable is really going to do the entire job for you, right? And just for those, I'm a very visual person, so every time I hear accuracy and precision, I kind of need a picture to see what that looks like. So, right, if you take any of those gas pieces, you're going to end up assuming hydrostatic mass equilibrium. If things are not in mass equilibrium, you're always going to be biased low, because there's always going to be these additional sources of non-thermal pressure supporting mass that you're not accounting for under that assumption. So that's like that clustered little offset in the lower right-hand corner. And you have sort of like the counterparts to that in every other direction. So yeah, ideally we're at the upper right-hand corner, but we can't do that with any one. So the things that cause certainly that systematic offset is very closely tied in with the galaxy cluster's quote dynamical state. Here I'm just showing that sort of like thought process of like, okay, if we can best constrain the observable mass relation, we can then get to a better cluster abundance, so number count as a function of mass, as a function of redshift, and then we can get to our nice banana plots for cosmology. So going back to we need multiple observables, let's take a look at what that does. Because combining observables can improve constraints. Many of you likely already know this, but this is a nice sort of pictorial example of how that can work. So this is showing cluster-based constraints on two particular cosmology parameters. So there's the mass variance in 8 megaparsec spheres and omega matter. So this orangey yellow, you see that the largest banana in here. This is from X-ray only in 2008. So you sort of see that it sort of spans that entire space. And iterative work following through Adam Mance's work for leading the Wing the Giants analysis. Essentially from 2008 to 2010, there's this improvement where you see sort of a shrink in that sort of diagonal direction, and that's largely due to cluster counts. So they're improving your statistical efforts. But what happened between 2010 and 2014 is mass calibration due to gravitational weak lensing. So adding another observable on top of the X-ray. And you'll see that this purple shrinks even further in that other direction as well. So this is a nice example of how combining observables very visually can improve your constraints. So let's talk about the various multi-wavelength observations that have sort of pushed forward over the last decade, right? I did want to highlight, there are a lot of folks involved with both DES and LSST here, so much of this might be sort of like news, but it's always nice to sort of review. So if I take a look at some past surveys in this, looking at how the limiting mass for that survey was as a function of redshift, let's just focus on only the red lines between SDSS and like sort of like the next generation of LSST, right? You'll notice that SDSS sort of almost pretty much hits similar limiting mass, but it doesn't quite go as far back in redshift as LSST. It's not quite as deep. Similarly, if we look at this in the space of like density of clusters found, density of clusters found as a function of redshift. You'll also see a similar comparison between SDSS and LSST, where right, like LSST just covers a lot more space in the density of clusters versus redshift. So that previous slide showed a number of different observing telescopes, both past and present in multiple wavelengths. So just to further motivate how incorporating multi-wavelength approaches is I think, a really great direction to go in. Just a side note that both this and the next two slides are teaser slides for Gus Everett's talk that you will all hear on August 20, but really great at illustrating the point I want to make. So these figures are from Farahi 2019 and Mulroy 2019, where on the left-hand side, this is showing the posterior mass derived from hierarchical Bayesian modeling of multiple observables of 41 clusters from the locus sample. And in red, sort of color-coded by the text I added there, are the weak lensing mass estimates. So the main comparison here, because there's multiple error bars, the boxes for the gray are the 25th, 75th percentile, and then the ticks for the red are also the 25th to 75th percentile. So those are the two that you'd want to compare. So you can see that in many cases, the posterior mass from hierarchical Bayesian modeling is more powerful because also, right, it doesn't have some of the like single systematics that are only present in the weak lensing mass. On the right-hand side, this is essentially showing the power of like using multiple simulations to validate what you're interpreting in your observations. So this is showing the correlation coefficient between a handful of gas observables, LXM gas, YXM gas, etc. For 3 different simulations using either different physics implementations or numerical approaches. So I do want to highlight it's important not to only compare with one simulation when doing this sort of a thing, because every simulation has its own, we'll call them physical uncertainties in how, as opposed to the astrophysical uncertainties in interpreting observations, right? So having these 3 simulations compared, where you can see, at least from the simulation standpoint, so this is the triangle, red circle, orange box, they're relatively consistent with one another. And then that gray band is essentially the constraint derived from the same 41 clusters on the left-hand side from the locus sample. And to further compare with like past observations, like those larger error bars are from MANS 2016 as well. So just to sort of highlight, maximize the information you're using, look at things like correlations, anti-correlations to understand some physics behind what is going into scaling relations, and ultimately folding in information in a self-consistent manner will get you to a more robust solution. So as another teaser, right, just to like, I'm a simulator, so I'm going to harp a little bit more on the simulations. Each simulation does have a slightly different approach, even if they're all like, oh, we include cooling star formation in AGN. The numerical scheme is different, whether they're using smooth particle hydrodynamics, some adaptive refinement, or in the case of a RIPO, this sort of like moving mesh grid thing, which semi-combines both to try to get both the best of both worlds. So this is work from a truly excellent undergrad who's working with Gus Everett at the University of Michigan, going on to grad school at UChicago next year. So keep an eye out for this person if you're looking to invite more talks. So what Daya had done was he essentially wanted to quantify differences or the robustness between these different simulation models, model predictions. So what you're looking at here is the probability distribution function of the normalized residuals of the number of satellite galaxies conditioned on mass for 3 simulations. So Bahamas Maxis, Magneticum, and the next generation. So the takeaway here is that you'll see, right, there's most is consistent with one another. There's maybe a little bit of a different skewness for TNG, but all three are better matched by a mixture model than a Gaussian, or better described rather by a mixture model than a Gaussian. So this example is really how satellite statistics that can be used to then inform optically selected cluster counts. Here is a figure from the same work now, getting towards a point that I like to also harp on. So this is, I think, just the TNG, which is what they had data for as much information to derive this kind of a plot. But this is showing the cumulative distribution function of those residuals, but now split, so now conditioned on whether it's a late forming or early forming galaxy cluster. And so you'll see that there's sort of like this nice little split between those, just focusing mainly on that orange lines. You'll see there's a similar split if conditioned on the mass, the stellar mass of the BCG. But these are sort of nice things to systematically look at to get a sense of what is driving scatter tilt residuals of your observable mass relation. So the reason I like to harp on this sort of a thing is because mass accretion history and overall just like the halo formation history, I think is crucial in really being able to efficiently model our observables. So one way to get at that, right, so that dynamical state is to take a look at shapes, the shapes of the galaxy cluster gas, the shapes of your underlying dark matter halo if you only have access to an n-body simulation. So previous works have shown that shapes are sensitive to both accretion, so from environmental dependence, and cosmology, which then impact your mass observable relations. Right, was sort of like a more of a larger sigma 8, and you're going to have this sort of like shift in your shape versus mass, right? Higher mass objects are later forming, and then with dark, are later forming, ergo will have sort of more elongated shapes. And if you include dark energies, and this other further tilt. So these shape encodes some information as well. In fact, shape morphology, that kind of language has been used as a key relaxedness criterion in a number of previous works. So things like the bulk asymmetry measures, saying like, oh yes, that looks like it's unrelaxed. So that was done a lot of this was done for mostly X-ray clusters where you could get at some sort of a shape measurement, or something like the peakiness of the X-ray surface brightness, right? So if you have, the thought process behind this is if you have very rapid major merger occurring, you're going to disrupt the cool core in the central regions. But if you still preserve that, that indicates you have a relaxed galaxy cluster. And a number of works have also tried to combine these visual measures in the X-ray. So this is from the observational perspective. Both Ellen Arazia and Adam Mans had come up with different ways to combine those features. So looking at the variety of shapes, so we need sort of some kind of a simulation with a number of clusters, some specified selection criteria to then sort of understand exactly what is going on when we use shape as maybe a proxy for relaxedness, or use that to tie into some other observable mass relation, right? So I'm going to show you some results as a case study from the Omega 500 sample. So I think I mentioned this before. This is the same sample from which those first two clusters in the very beginning were derived from. The Omega 500 sample is a mass limited cluster sample simulated using the adaptive refinement tree. And this is sort of just a panel of like a number of the mock X-rays that came out of the sample. So highlighting this also, if folks are interested in using this, this is one of the products that is shareable, and we're happy to share from the various groups. So just a little bit more information in case you are interested. So it's running with the adaptive refinement tree with 62 clusters, mass selected, right? So above mass 3 times 10 to the 14, matching a lot of, say, SC selected cluster samples. The overall box size is 500 megaparsecs. So this is sort of, instead of doing individual zoom-ins, we did region zoom-ins in one big box and did it sort of all in one shot. This is, we have runs for non-radiative cooling and star formation and AGN containing clusters to look at the systematic effects of adding additional physics. So the other thing I wanted to point out when you're dealing with large simulations is many folks who are in large collaborations, you need teamwork to get things both done and produced. So just to sort of highlight the number of things that went into producing this single box, everything from so the PI who enables the science and resources for simulations to folks who develop the specific hydrocode, the Halo Finder ran specific boxes because that is non-trivial, developing specific modules for physics, all that goes in there. To then arrive at the ability to do some kind of analysis, such as looking at how recent accretion drives the ICM shape. So those two images from the very beginning are two highlighted plots from a paper by a graduate student I mentored at UChicago, Huncheng Chen, where she essentially looked at ways to classify slow and fast accretors and took a look at how that impacted the ICM shape. So on the left, again, that slow accretor accreting as slowly as a tortoise, and on the right, a fast accretor accreting quickly, lots of material, the way a hair runs down. This is sort of like how I remember it. Tortoises are round and hairs are really long. Very visual person here. So you'll notice that there's a bunch of sort of lines and tick marks overplotted, and that's to give some parallel with what observers do. So overplotted are the X-ray relaxation combined criteria from the Adamensis SPA code. This is symmetry, peakiness, and alignment. So we did some initial comparisons with some of those measurements. So just to show, right, like there's the ellipticity of the isophotes, shift and centroid that you can look at. So those are for the observables in X-ray. But what you can do in simulations is you can look directly at the 3D axis ratio. You can trace galaxy clusters in their entire history. So you can take a look at their accretion rate, and you can, from the merger trees, like measure the maximum merger ratio. So I should mention that the accretion rate that Huncheng looked at is actually a modified Diemer-Kravtsov accretion rate. Typically, they looked at the accretion rate since redshift 1, so how much, what the change in mass is since that epoch, whereas Huncheng took a look at how varying that time scale better informed us of the predicted ICM shape. So let's take a look at what she found. So it turns out accretion rate and accretion mode matter. So by mode, I mean recent merger history. So on the y-axis, I'm showing that shape C of rays, so this is the major axis ratio as an example, measured at R 500.3. It does matter where you measure your shape because, right, galaxy clusters are not super regular. They're definitely not spherical, as this is the point is here. And just going down the y-axis means that those clusters are more elliptical. On the x-axis is that proxy for halo formation history, right? So this is the mass accretion rate since expansion factor of 0.7. And so to the right means it's faster accreting. So I sort of roughly circled where the smooth accreting, moderate mergers, and major mergers are, where these are defined by the listed merger ratios on the right-hand side. And you'll see that they all kind of overlap. But there is this overall trend where, right, like the lower your max merger ratio, you tend to be slower accreting, and also therefore much less elliptical, so much rounder. But this is sort of like this exists on a continuum. And just to sort of highlight the visuals that you're familiar with, those same exact two clusters from the very start, this is where they sit in this space, in the C over array and the gamma 200 mean. So you can see it very relaxed, definitely in the upper left-hand side of the space, and a very unrelaxed, definitely all the way down in the least, or the most elliptical and one of the faster accreting clusters. So I mentioned, right, the shape was measured at 0.3, and then also it was at a given time scale for which Huncheng had measured the accretion rate. So it turns out, right, both of those things really do matter, as you might expect with physical intuition. So a way we got at that was looking at how well correlated each of these measurements were so shape measured at various radii compared with accretion measured over some time scale. So this is the Spearman correlation coefficient as a function of radius at which shape was measured. And each of the lines is the accretion rate measured at different over different epochs. So starting from expansion factor of 0.5, so redshift 1, all the way to expansion factor 0.9. So since these are all negative correlations, so increasing negative correlation means stronger correlation. So what you'll notice is that starting from the time scale of 0.5 to 0.7, you get an increasing correlation, which then weakens until you get to looking at the accreted material over just only that short bit of time between expansion factor 0.9 and now. So it turns out that there's a sweet spot for like the accretion rate that best determines, timescale for measuring an accretion rate that best predicts what kind of a shape you have. And you'll notice that this holds at all radii. We took a look to see how the merger mode impacted this, this effect. So still you have the same timescale, that same color line is still at the very bottom with the strongest correlation. And here we've excluded the major mergers, but the main difference between this and this you'll see is that the correlation in the inner region is weakened, and that's because, or when you exclude the major mergers, you don't have as many events that are able to upset what happens, upset the shape in the inner regions to then impact it sufficiently enough to drive the correlation to a stronger coefficient. But yeah, still you see that same strengthening and weakening with time scale. All right, so this is all well and good, right? This is like simulation world. We're connecting accretion and shape to scatter, but we want to connect that to scatter and the mass observable relation. So, right, the observable mass relation has some sort of a residual off of it. And if we can connect that to something physical, that's a nice thing to understand and then better inform different kind of modeling modes for saying like, hey, here's a predicted mass observable relation and the entire scatter and spread about that. So looking at the residual for a particular example of the TXM mass observable relation as a function of accretion rate, what we see here is that faster accreting clusters are cooler. So the way to think about this is, right, if you're faster accreting, you're accreting a lot more material that has a lot of bulk kinetic motion, so non-thermal pressure support, that has not yet been able to thermalize. So it's relatively cooler. And because it's recently accreting, you're also going to be rounder, right? So if you take a look at that kind of a measure for relaxedness, you'll see that looking at the residual of TXM relations with the shape axis ratio, you see that rounder and hotter clusters, so rounder clusters tend to be hotter. So the more relaxed you are, that means you've had some time to then fully thermalize all of the stuff that you've accreted over your entire past. You're more fully thermalized, you've ticked up in the residual of the TXM relation. So that kind of a relationship, my description sort of alluded to, like, oh, if you want to like sort of model this in a very fast way, so that's pointing towards Baryon painting prescriptions and the kind of work that Huanqing did. I like to think of as an example of groundwork for those activities. So when I say Baryon pasting, I think a lot of folks, right, typically know this as like semi-alembic modeling, but essentially, right, you have some sort of a halo property that you get from dark matter only simulation, so mass accretion rate and shape, and some observable, like some integrated property, like your overall TX, some profile of, say, like the gas or the stellar distribution, etc. The reason you would want to paste baryons onto things if you ever wanted to model something is, well, okay, the simulations I showed you before had like 62 clusters. But what we want is like a really large, varied sample, and we want to sort of be able to vary our model and then sort of test that against observations. And the kind of observations we're going to have are going to have many more than 62 clusters, right? We're stepping beyond the dozens of clusters regime. And it's not really computationally feasible to have like as full of physics as possible run over multiple different physics runs for thousands and thousands and thousands of clusters. But you can do this with the dark matter, right? You can run dark matter only boxes that are very, very large. And you can come up with some sort of a Baryon pasting prescription then to sort of test your assumptions and the relationships that you come up with, maybe based on fully hydro runs and a smaller sample, but then generalized to take a look at what the statistics look like in a larger box sample. So again, like many things, it requires a large group to do all the things one might want to do. So I just wanted to introduce relatively informal collaboration that I'm a part of called the Baryon Pasters. It's an international group with a number of folks who are interested in doing the activity that I just described and applying to a number of other things. We welcome other people, anyone who's interested in delving into ideas, sharing both ideas and work and to bring to fruition some really nice results that can really plug into some of these both multi-wavelength and for any one of these single telescopes that are bringing in large amounts of data. So to tell you a little bit about one of the streamlined pipelines that folks are working on, primarily led by both Ken Osato at Tokyo and Erwin Lau at Miami. It's still under development, but enough of a prototype that there was a hack session, sort of a guided sprint during the last LSST desk meeting, where what you can do is you can take in either the Halo catalog or individual dark matter particles, which will be much more computationally expensive, but you can more closely trace the matter distribution that way. You compute some sort of a semi-analytic set of properties based on the Halo properties, or say like pasting on the dark matter particles in particular. Paste your baryons, and then you project onto some sort of observable like X-ray and SC, you add noise, you produce FITS images, and sort of at the end of the day, you want to be able to do that apples to apples comparison, run your analysis the way you would on your actual observations. So FITS images is sort of like the choice there, at least for now. So some science goals to give you some highlight of this is folks are interested in accurate modeling of selection functions to seek reasonable multivariate mass observable relations. See how the pasting modifies your cosmic shear, cluster galaxy lensing, galaxy clustering, etc. So there's a number of planned efforts. It's always welcome more hands on deck, but just to give you a sense of what some folks are doing. I'm still sort of on the mass accretion rate horse, and I have a post-baccalaureate student, Luis Machado, who's working with me on modeling, predicting the shape as a function of radius, given a bunch of other properties that you might be able to more easily get. So he's using some machine learning techniques in order to do that. And there's a number of other things like calibrating your SAM down of gas down to the CGM, because we've mostly been cluster focused. Painting galaxies onto filaments. That hasn't been done too much in terms of like looking at what can be done in filaments. Unifying models of stars and gas, because a lot of times people just do individual ones, looking at gaseous substructures. Some folks are thinking about that, haven't really started. But to give you a nice, like, pretty example instead of just lists, this is a Baryon pasting example looking at the SC effect. So this is from Ken's work, which is then applied to HSC cross-Planck analysis, where he composed a Compton Y all-sky mock based on some dark matter only simulations, and just the SC effect, just as a quick review for folks, for students in the room. This is essentially the backlight of the cosmic microwave background. As it passes through the hot intercluster medium gas, those photons get upscattered, right? And then you end up with this shift in the lights in the spectrum of those cosmic microwave background photons. So you can either see it as an uptick or a downtick depending on where you're observing your CMB. And in that line of sight, I have a cluster. So you painted those on using both the Shaw and the Flender model, which was more particle-particle based. So just a nice little example. There's a galaxy cluster that's been backlit. So many of us are involved with LSST desk, as I know several folks are at LIneA, but here's something very specific to that, where Erwin Lau and a number of other folks had input a light cone simulation in order to then paste on both the X-ray flux and the YSC. So for LSST simulations, this is some initial things that they'd looked at, and there's further development going on in that direction as well. So for this Baryon pasting application, right, the specific examples I've given, right, take in Halo properties, mass accretion rate, maybe dark matter density also, and then spit out some observable. Those things can be then compared with something like the Shaw model as well, which is a little less pasty, but like analytic. So just stepping back, right, see, actually, I think I'm running a little short on time, so I think I might want to skip over that and just come to the final bit of my talk, talking about additional LSST desk efforts. So I think that initial figure, right, showed that the weak lensing mass is further in that upper right-hand corner, right, but where it's less systematically biased than all of your gas measurements, because it's not a gas measurement, it's directly probing your mass along the line of sight. But this is also something that needs to be tested and calibrated. It's ANO as a signal, but also is susceptible to things like projection effects, etc. So for weak lensing masses, just a quick cartoon review, again, for students in the room. Let's say you have a bunch of very idealized spherical galaxies. If you plop a galaxy cluster smack in front of it, you're going to end up lensing those galaxy shapes. So these shapes get sheared, sort of extended, maybe magnified, depending on exactly where it's sitting. And you can use the measurements of those galaxy shears, you measure those in a statistical way to then infer the intervening mass that's been plopped in between you and those background source galaxies. The thing is, weak lensing mass estimates have a model dependence. So this is just an example of testing some MXXL halos with different concentration examples. So like the Damer-Kravtsov 2015 concentration mass relation, set concentration of C equals 5, 4, and 3. You'll notice that this actually has a very systematic effect on what the weak lensing mass that gets popped out is. So this is the weak lensing, the mean bias as a function of mass for each of these things. Right, and essentially what's going on there is if you have a cartoon right here of this dark matter density as a function of radius, and then you assume a lower concentration, there's a degeneracy between that and sort of like shifting around the other the mass distribution, so you end up with that mean bias that's low. There are a number of things that you'd want to look at in terms of weak lensing mass calibration. So I think I didn't quite mention this, but the primary cluster-based cosmology approach for LSST clusters will be through the weak lensing mass, is looking at how you're combining your very noisy data. So are you stacking all of your mass? Are you individually fitting things in a hierarchical framework to get at that mass posterior? How can you incorporate tested observational effects like miscentering and your selection effects, etc.? So all of these are really necessary because we are going, and blending is something that I didn't really even talk about at all, but with large data sets, right, we are no longer in a statistics limited regime of cluster-based cosmology. We are in a systematics limited regime. So for something like LSST, we're just gonna get many, many more clusters. Combining these with other wavelengths can help mitigate those like observable specific systematics, but we do have to do those individual tests to understand what every observable is faced with, especially with like observing strategy and the depth of LSST in particular. I just want to show this pretty picture. I just kept it from like last fall. I was looking, there was some clips down there found in the Facebook group. But I thought this is just like a nice, like, yes, we are studying the sky. I wanted to highlight how a lot of those tests are going on and co-development is going on in LSST, because this is something that I've particularly enjoyed. It's the cluster mass calibration team where our goal is to essentially create a tool, be publicly available. So even if you're not an LSST, but if you're looking to join, it's a great space. That the desk, that collaboration is really awesome to interact with. We had a collaboration meeting last week, so that was a lot of fun. But we want things to be as user-friendly as possible, right? So everything from having tutorials to example notebooks. The team is preparing for version 1.0 code release, where it will be this like nicely packaged, well-documented thing for, I think especially for like starting graduate students, whether they're observers or simulators, so they don't have to like sort of start from scratch and say, oh, I want to like estimate the weak lensing mass for either the simulated map or some data that they have, and they start writing something from scratch. Here's something they can at least start with, and if they want to do some other things, maybe contribute or branch off on their own. This is an example from, so this is the product of several sort of collaboration hack days, hack weeks, retreats. So since 2018, we've been doing this. Michelle's been an awesome contributor, like super, super active, and yeah, but one of our more prolific contributors. That's been really great. You can see him here, Hack Retreat in Pittsburgh, in Germany, and most recently, oh, let's use, okay, ignore that. But most recently, right, like everyone's doing remote. So this is our last hack day where you can see your LIneA representation here. So it's been a lot of fun, and this is definitely a source of like pride and joy every time we get together to like write some code and with the plans of sharing it with the entire world. So something I started doing in a lot of my talks has been to do a snippet of the kind of outreach I'm also very excited and passionate about. I think a handful of folks have just started this trend, and I'm like, that's a great idea. Because I talked a lot about the communities and how the communities have sort of led to like building some really awesome, great things. Everything from sort of like a smallish size like simulation team to a code team through an entire collaboration to just like a very like informal but like large group of people from which you can get feedback from. But one particular community that I guess I started out in as a graduate student is the software and data carpentry community, where the goal is to teach basic lab skills for research computing, but it's everything from basic to a little bit more senior level, depending on what you're looking to develop. So in particular, the things that I've taught through this as well, that was sort of like the thing I did for my outreach as a graduate student. But there's also online free resources that's community developed for like learning about the Unix shell, version control with Git, programming Python, everything that is starting either undergrad or grad student needs to get started on any of the research topics that I mentioned before. So, okay, not now because of the pandemic, but the carpentries would essentially organize and send out instructors essentially right for free, but they have to be hosted by like an individual department or the professional meeting or the institution. And so this is something that they might be doing webinars now, but if it's something that you're interested in for your students, I highly recommend plugging into this resource. It's a really good crowd and really open and invested in just educating people in the best sphere possible. So just to summarize, we're going to need a confluence of n-body, hydro, and simulink modeling to fully leverage the next generation of cosmology experiments and to also just like address things from multiple wavelengths. One of the primary examples I just highlighted was how galaxy clusters' mass accretion history is, in fact, a critical component in developing these models to, for instance, paint baryons onto dark matter-only simulations. And there are a number of community code developments, and I think it really just community code work where different people are looking at a code base, improving on it, using it, making things more user-friendly, and this like nice little feedback loop. I think that's going to be key, especially in the era of LSST. Great, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Camille. Now we open the floor for questions.
Should I stop? No, I could, yeah, I should keep sharing in case.
So I think
Hi,
that's,
oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
Hi. Okay, Mariana, how are you?
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, Mariana, go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you. Camille, when we paint the dark matter halos with baryon information, for example, when we include a pressure profile or any other description, we let it evolve it. We perform like another simulation on top of this dark matter simulation. We let it, Angelo, please. We let it evolve, or is something fixed when we paint this information?
Right now, it's fixed in the sense it's snapshot by snapshot. I can imagine an extension. I don't have a good picture of how to do this, where you can sort of like do a slight evolution on top of that. But yeah, right now it's snapshot by snapshot. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Okay, and then we also, so we can cover a large range of mass, for example, from low mass to higher mass. So we can just include this information for high masses halos, high massive halos.
So folks in the baryon pasting group are mostly interested in things between 10 to the 12 and 10 to the few 10 to the 14, 10 to the 15. But I think that's primarily because of like we're calibrating off of hydrosims, and those are the hydrosims we have access to now and the areas of interest. But I think folks, there's a handful, I think I mentioned one of the students is interested in sort of modeling down to the CGM. I don't know the status of that project yet, but we're open to conversations for people going down to lower masses for sure.
Nice. So for cluster, this is okay. 10 to 12.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of us are clusters people, so that's sort of baryon pasting in clusters. Because I think, right, semi-analytic modeling, at least from my perspective of like how I was sort of like taught, like here's the history of modeling, right? Semi-analytic modeling made a lot of sense for years for galaxies. You have a lot more galaxies, but like clusters, if you only have a handful, why would you do? Right? Whereas now I think we're in an era where you can't try to do self-consistent hydro plus all this other like astrophysics modeling for thousands of clusters that it's like, okay, I think we're sort of in the where galaxies might have been before and just thinking about ways to do that. That's my perspective, at least, and my take on how that's went down.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So I have a good question concerning the observable mass relation scattered. How is that? How does that depend on the cluster finding algorithm?
Oh, that's a really good question. This is cluster finding is not my area of expertise. I think, but that is definitely one of the primary things that a subset of folks in baryon pasting and if folks here are cluster finders wanting to explore that with some of the tools that are being developed. That is one of the sources of systematics, because I do think that is a source of a systematic that folks will want to explore, right? Because I think from what I understand with like, right, say like RedMapper, you're going to tend to be in sort of like this relatively more crowded, denser fields, and you have tend to have more projection. So then all of a sudden you have this shift in your observable mass because by virtue of what you're selecting. But we haven't had any sort of full, complete analyses of that yet with the baryon pasting, but it's an area of interest because we recognize that this is a major contributor as well, especially for the optical, I think.
Okay, you, Camille.
Thanks.
Hi, I have a question. First, I wanted to thank you for the very, very interesting webinar. And my question is also about baryon pasting.
Sure.
I wanted to know how strong the dependence is on a fiducial cosmology, if you have any.
Oh, okay. We have not tested on multiple cosmologies yet. One thing, okay, so there's sort of like a related kind of semi under the baryon pasting umbrella. I have a graduate student who's essentially, I think it's the dark skies simulation. There's like a website with all the publicly available dark matter simulations, taking a look at the Halo catalogs and starting to look at trends of essentially how mass accretion history impacts snapshot parameters, because he's just working in the dark matter sphere alone. And one of the things he is interested, that he'll want to differentiate between is like, okay, how dependent are things on cosmology? From some initial things that I've seen, it's not too strong a dependence on, we have to look further into it, but that's definitely a key component, because like, okay, cosmology, it's not just astrophysics, it's folded in with cosmology as well.
Thanks.
Great. Any more questions? So, okay, then I'll have a question. So when you take into account this mass accretion rates into in the baryon pasting, which from what I understood, it's going to affect how you extract or try to extract cosmology from clusters, because it's going to affect how you estimate the mass. So which mass estimate is more affected by that, would you say?
Oh, which mass estimates are more affected by dynamical state or like shape as a proxy for that?
Yes.
I mean, definitely, though that would be mostly the, thinking about like the square plot, the lower left-hand, like all the gas proxies, things that rely on hydrostatic equilibrium. Mostly, I think this is also going to, I haven't looked at a wide enough range of sort of like in the weak lensing regime, but I mean, we would also expect, so Ricardo Hovernet recently put out a paper looking at the BCG shape as a proxy for halo shape, because that's easier to measure, and to sort of see if there's like a systematic, like if you split on BCG shapes, so like the nicer, rounder, more regular BCG shapes, what is the weak lensing mass bias estimate, but using the sort of X-ray gas mass as a proxy. So it looked like there's also a dependence there. I think it most affects the gas proxies, but there's definitely an effect on the weak lensing, or sorry, a correlation, because it's like dynamically disturbed. There are other things that fall into that.
Right. And is there a work where that was quantified?
Oh, for weak lensing or for?
Well, for any of them.
Oh, sure. I mean, shape as a proxy. So Huancheng's paper looks at also, like the non-thermal pressure fraction as well. So like that to quantify the bias. So there's a bias, but then also like the overall scatter is the major thing that we saw, or that we looked at. But it does tie in with the hydrostatic mass. And I think, yeah, a number of folks have also done, I think some of the papers coming out of the 300 simulations, that group has started to look at quantifying both SC and X-ray observables as well. It's just not coming to close memory right now, but those are the prime examples that I can think of.
I see. Okay, any more questions? So I guess I'll ask again then.
Oh, sure, go for it. Yeah.
So this method of baryon pacing, it to me looks like very similar to what they're doing on DC2, right? The way the simulation is constructed, where they have like this very large dark matter simulation, then they more similarly kind of pace the property of the galaxies there.
That's right. Yeah.
Is it the same framework that's done, or is it something similar?
So the quote pipeline that I described, that is not the same framework as what is being used for DC2 specifically, and like the DC2 to produce the DC2 catalogs. I think that's like a largely like very Argon and plus based effort. Andrew Heron is in the baryon pasting group, so there's some crosstalk, and there are plans. So a lot of what the baryon pasters are thinking of is largely multi-wavelength approaches. So Marina Ricci is one of the people who's like interested in bridging the two efforts, so like applying some baryon pasting stuff to the simulations that produce DC2, so we have sort of the multi-wavelength component. So TLDR answer, it's not the same framework, but we're interested in like merging that framework to be of use to DC2 in particular.
I see, thank you. Okay, any more questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, seeing as we're on the hour, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you very much, Camille. And next week we'll have Ethan Nadler from Stanford University talking about dwarf galaxy dark matter microphysics constraints. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and especially Camille. It was a very interesting seminar.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. I guess we'll see each other next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Camille. Bye-bye.